When my daughter-in-law spoke, her voice was calm. Too calm. It wasn't the kind of calm that comes from kindness or care. It was the kind of calm that feels rehearsed, like the words had been practiced many times in her head before they ever reached her mouth. The kind of calm that leaves no room for questions, no space for emotion, no opening for negotiation. It felt final, even before she said anything at all. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look angry. She didn't even look at me for very long. Her eyes met mine for only a second, just long enough to make sure I was listening, and then they drifted away again, back to the small square of fabric in her hands. She stood near the kitchen counter, folding a dish towel slowly, carefully smoothing out each crease as if she had all the time in the world. As if this moment did not carry the weight of a lifetime for me. As if this was just another small task in her day, like putting away groceries or wiping crumbs from the table. The kitchen smelled faintly of soap and something sweet from earlier, maybe the tea she had made for herself. Sunlight came in through the window, landing softly on the floor. Everything looked warm and ordinary. That made it worse. Nothing around us seemed to recognize that my world was about to shift. And then she said it. "I think it would be better if you found somewhere else to stay." That was it. No long explanation. No soft introduction. No, "I'm sorry," to soften the blow. Just one sentence, spoken gently, like she was suggesting a change in dinner plans or a different brand of laundry soap. Her voice did not shake. Her hands did not stop moving. The towel was folded neatly, placed on the counter, and she let out a quiet breath, as if she had just finished something slightly uncomfortable but necessary. I stood there, holding the edge of the chair to steady myself, even though my legs hadn't moved. I felt as if the ground beneath me had tilted, just slightly, not enough to knock me down, but enough to make everything feel unsure. The words echoed in my head, slow and heavy, repeating themselves over and over. "It would be better if you found somewhere else to stay." Better for who? Better how? She didn't say. And I didn't ask. I remember smiling. Even now, when I think back on that moment, that smile confuses me. It appeared on my face without permission, like a reflex I had learned long ago. I don't know why I smiled. Maybe it was shock, the kind that freezes you and makes you act strangely. Maybe it was pride, the stubborn kind that refuses to beg or argue. Maybe I simply didn't want her to see me break apart in front of her kitchen counter. I smiled because crying felt too honest. Because anger felt too loud. Because silence felt safer. Inside, something cracked quietly, like a thin piece of glass breaking where no one could hear it. It wasn't a loud shatter. There was no dramatic pain at first. Just a small, sharp feeling deep in my chest, like something important had been damaged beyond repair. I thought of everything I had given them. Not just the obvious things, but the quiet ones that never get counted. I had given them my years, the years when my body was strong enough to work, to help, to support. I had given them my savings, the little bit I had put aside so I would never be a burden, now slowly disappearing in the name of family. I had given them my strength, my patience, my silence, my willingness to bend and adjust and make myself smaller so everyone else could be comfortable. And now, standing in that warm kitchen, I was being dismissed like an old chair that no longer matched the room. Not broken enough to throw away with anger, just outdated, unnecessary, taking up space. I nodded slowly, still smiling, afraid that if I stopped smiling, something ugly and uncontrollable might escape me. "All right," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, thin and distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. I don't remember if she thanked me. I don't remember if she said anything else at all. What I remember clearly is the look on her face when I agreed so easily. She looked relieved. Not sad. Not conflicted. Relieved. That hurt more than anything else she could have done. That small change in her expression told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a sudden decision. This wasn't said in anger or frustration. This was something she had wanted for a while. Something she had been waiting to say. My quiet acceptance made it easier for her to breathe again. I turned away before she could see my eyes fill. I walked down the hallway slowly, past the framed photos on the wall. There were pictures of birthdays, holidays, smiling faces frozen in time. I appeared in some of them, standing just slightly to the side, always careful not to be in the center. I wondered how long it would take before I was removed from those frames, or if anyone would even notice. That night, I lay awake in the small room they had given me, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned again and again. Its soft whirring sound filled the silence, steady and uncaring. I had spent so many nights in that room telling myself I was lucky to have a place, lucky to be near my son, lucky to still be useful. Now the room felt different, like it already knew I didn't belong there anymore. I listened to the house breathe. The low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. The occasional creak of the floor as someone walked past my door. The distant sound of laughter from the living room, light and easy, untouched by what had just happened. Life was continuing, smoothly and comfortably, without me. I felt very small in that bed, wrapped in a blanket that suddenly felt too thin. My hands rested on my chest, and that was when the pain finally reached my eyes. Not loud sobs, not shaking cries, just quiet tears slipping out and soaking into the pillow. Tears I had been holding back for years without realizing it. I thought about all the endings I had imagined in my life. I never imagined this one. I never imagined being asked to leave by someone who spoke as if my absence would barely be noticed. I never imagined my son's silence would hurt more than words ever could. In the dark, with only the ceiling fan watching me, I whispered to myself, barely loud enough to hear. So this is how it ends. Not with shouting. Not with anger. Not with a fight. But with calm words, folded towels, and a smile I didn't mean to wear. I never planned to live with my son and his wife. That was never the picture I held in my mind when I thought about growing older. I always imagined myself in my own small place, quiet and familiar, where every corner carried my history and every sound belonged to me. I imagined independence until the very end, even if my steps became slower and my hands a little weaker. I had lived my whole life standing on my own feet, and I believed I would finish it the same way. I was independent once. Strong. Proud. Those words were not just ideas to me, they were how I survived. When my husband passed away far too early, the world didn't pause to let me grieve properly. There were children to raise, bills to pay, food to put on the table. I learned quickly that sorrow had to wait until night, until everyone else was asleep. During the day, I became something harder, something steadier. I worked long hours, sometimes 2 jobs, my body aching but my face calm. I skipped meals without thinking about it, telling myself I'd eat later, even when later never came. I learned how to fix broken things, how to make decisions alone, how to answer questions with confidence even when I was terrified inside. I became both mother and father without ever saying it out loud. I tied shoelaces, attended school meetings, stayed up late helping with homework, and woke up early to make sure there was breakfast. I never complained, not because it wasn't hard, but because complaining felt like weakness, and weakness felt dangerous. There was simply no time for it. Life kept moving, and I had to move with it or be left behind. My son grew up watching all of this. He was always kind, even as a child. Quiet in a way that made you lean closer when he spoke. Thoughtful in ways that surprised me, like the way he would notice when I was tired and bring me a glass of water without being asked. He used to hold my hand when crossing the street, even when he was already taller than me. His hand would wrap around mine, warm and steady, and I would think to myself that maybe I had done something right after all. When he married her, I truly believed I was gaining a daughter. I remember standing at their wedding, watching her smile as she walked toward him, and feeling a strange mix of joy and relief. She seemed gentle then. Polite. Careful with her words. Respectful in the way she spoke to me, calling me Mom with a small, shy smile. I told myself that families grow, that this was how life was supposed to unfold. I imagined shared meals, quiet conversations, maybe even laughter in the kitchen as we learned each other's ways. For a long time, that belief carried me. As the years passed, my body began to change in ways I could no longer ignore. My health weakened slowly, not dramatically, but enough to remind me that time was doing its work. The stairs in my old apartment, which I had climbed without thought for decades, began to feel steeper. Each step demanded more effort, more care. Some days, I had to stop halfway and catch my breath, my hand gripping the railing while I pretended it was nothing. Loneliness also began to settle in, quietly at first. The silence in the evenings grew heavier than before, pressing against my chest in a way that made it hard to breathe. That was when my son suggested I move in with them. "It'll be easier for you, Mom," he said, sitting across from me at my small kitchen table. His voice was gentle, the same voice he used when he was a boy asking for permission to stay up late. "You won't have to worry about the stairs. We'll be right there if you need anything." I hesitated. My heart pulled one way, my pride another. I looked around my apartment, at the worn sofa, the familiar walls, the little marks and scratches that told the story of my life. This place had held my tears and my strength. It had seen me at my worst and never judged me. The idea of leaving it felt like leaving a part of myself behind. But they insisted. He insisted. She nodded along, adding that it would be safer, that it made sense, that families were supposed to look after one another. Their words were kind enough, and I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe that accepting help did not mean giving up who I was. So I sold my small apartment. I gave up my space, the only place that had ever truly been mine. I packed my life into a few suitcases, choosing what to take and what to leave behind, each decision heavier than the last. Some things I gave away. Some I threw out. Some I held in my hands for a long time before deciding they couldn't come with me. I carried my memories into their home, tucked between folded clothes and old photographs, hoping they would fit somewhere. At first, I tried to be invisible. That felt like the safest way to exist. I woke up early, before anyone else, moving quietly through the house so I wouldn't disturb them. I cleaned without being asked, wiping counters, folding laundry, making myself useful in small, quiet ways. I stayed out of their way, spending most of my time in the room they had given me, a room that never quite felt like it belonged to me. I told myself again and again, "This is temporary. Don't be a burden." I repeated those words like a prayer. I reminded myself that I was a guest, even though I was family. I watched my steps, measured my words, learned their routines and adjusted myself around them. I laughed softly, never too loud. I spoke only when spoken to, afraid that too much of my presence might become irritating. But homes have feelings. They absorb the moods and tensions of the people living inside them. And people change when space becomes shared, especially when that space was never meant to hold so many lives at once. Slowly, almost without warning, the air shifted. The warmth I had felt at the beginning began to thin. Conversations became shorter. Smiles didn't last as long. Doors closed more often. I felt it before I understood it. A subtle change, like a draft you can't quite trace. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being sensitive, that I should be grateful. But deep down, something knew. Something quiet and tired knew that I was no longer just a mother living with her son. I was becoming something else. Something easier to overlook. And that was how I became part of their home. Not by choice, not by plan, but by slow steps and silent adjustments, until one day I realized that belonging and being allowed to stay were not always the same thing. It didn't start with shouting. There were no slammed doors, no raised voices echoing through the house, no angry words thrown like sharp stones. If it had started that way, maybe I would have understood it better. Anger, at least, announces itself. It gives you something solid to react to. But this was different. This was quiet, careful, almost polite. And somehow, that made it hurt more. It never does start loudly. It begins in places so small you almost miss them, especially if you are the kind of person who has spent a lifetime overlooking her own discomfort for the sake of others. It began with small looks that passed over me instead of landing on me, like my face had become part of the furniture. With short replies that ended conversations before they truly began. With doors that closed gently but firmly, leaving me standing on the other side, listening to voices that no longer included me. One day, I noticed she stopped asking if I'd eaten. It sounds like such a small thing, almost foolish to mention, but it mattered. In the beginning, she would call out from the kitchen, asking if I wanted tea or if I was hungry. It made me feel seen, included, like I was still part of the rhythm of the house. Then, slowly, those questions disappeared. Meals were prepared without a word to me. Cups were poured and carried away without an extra glance in my direction. I began to eat alone more often, quietly, at odd hours, telling myself it was better this way, that I didn't want to be in anyone's way. My presence began to feel inconvenient, like something that needed to be worked around. If I sat in the living room, the TV volume went down, not all at once, but gradually, until it was barely a whisper. It felt like a signal, a gentle suggestion that my being there required adjustment, that I was somehow disrupting their comfort. If I spoke, even to say something small or harmless, conversations ended abruptly, as if a switch had been flipped. Smiles faded. Phones were picked up. Someone would suddenly remember something that needed to be done elsewhere. I began to measure my movements carefully. I learned which chairs were safer to sit in, which times of day were better to stay in my room. I learned the sound of their footsteps, the tone of their laughter, the way the house felt when I entered a room. There were moments when everything seemed to pause, just for a second, as if my presence required a reset. Sometimes, I overheard things I wasn't meant to hear. Words drifted down the hallway or through half-closed doors, landing in my ears before I had time to protect myself. They never said my name, but I knew who they meant. "She's always here," she said once, her voice low but edged with something sharp. Another time, I heard, "She wouldn't understand," followed by a quiet laugh that made my chest tighten. And then there was the sentence that stayed with me the longest, spoken with a tired sigh, "We need our privacy." Each word felt like a small cut. Not deep enough to bleed openly, but enough to leave a mark. I wanted to knock on the door and tell them that I had once had a life full of privacy, that I had given it up out of love and necessity. I wanted to remind them that I, too, understood the need for space, for quiet, for a home that feels like your own. But I didn't. I stood still, listening, pretending I hadn't heard anything at all. Instead, I tried harder. That seemed like the right thing to do, the only thing I knew how to do. I cooked meals they liked, memorizing their preferences, adjusting spices and flavors until the food was exactly how they wanted it. I folded laundry carefully, making sure every edge was straight, every shirt smoothed just right. I kept my opinions to myself, even when I had something to say, even when my heart ached to be heard. I swallowed my words and told myself they were unnecessary, that silence was a gift. But the more I tried, the smaller I felt. It was as if each effort erased a little more of me, like I was slowly fading into the background. I began to question myself constantly. Was I too slow? Too quiet? Too present? I replayed every interaction in my mind, searching for mistakes, for moments when I might have been too much. I apologized more often, sometimes without even knowing why. "Sorry," became my most used word, slipping out of my mouth automatically. My son avoided my eyes. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Surely, he wouldn't look away from me on purpose. But then I noticed the pattern. When I entered a room, his gaze would drift to his phone or the television. When I spoke, he nodded without really listening. When our eyes did meet, it was brief, almost accidental, and then gone again. It felt like he was afraid of what he might see if he looked at me too closely. That hurt the most. More than her words, more than her silence, more than the way the house seemed to close in around me. I could have endured her discomfort if he had still seen me. If he had still recognized the woman who raised him, who held his hand, who stayed awake at night worrying about his future. But his avoidance felt like a quiet rejection, a turning away that I couldn't ignore. Sometimes, I wanted to stop him in the hallway, take his face in my hands the way I used to when he was small, and ask him, "Do you remember who I was to you?" I wanted to ask if he remembered the nights I stayed up sewing his clothes, the mornings I went to work tired but smiling, the way I cheered for him even when no one else did. I wanted to remind him that I was more than just someone taking up space in his house. But I stayed quiet. Because mothers like me were raised to endure. We were taught that love means sacrifice, that silence is strength, that asking for too much makes you selfish. We learned to make ourselves smaller so others could grow, and we carried that lesson with us into every stage of life. Enduring had become second nature to me, as natural as breathing. So I endured the quiet looks, the short replies, the closed doors. I endured the feeling of slowly disappearing in a place that was supposed to be my home. I told myself that this was the price of family, that patience would fix everything, that if I just waited long enough, things would change. But deep inside, in a place I tried not to visit, a question began to form, soft but persistent. It whispered to me late at night, when the house was quiet and I was alone with my thoughts. How long can a person endure before there is nothing left of them to endure with? That afternoon was ordinary in every way that mattered to the world, and maybe that is why it stays with me so clearly. Nothing in the air warned me. There were no signs, no tension sharp enough to cut, no raised voices or hurried movements. It was just another quiet day, the kind that passes without leaving a mark, except this one did. It left a mark so deep that even now, I can still feel it when I close my eyes. The sunlight fell gently across the kitchen floor, warm and soft, stretching out in long lines that moved slowly as the day went on. It made the room feel peaceful, almost kind. I stood by the counter, peeling apples one by one, the thin skin curling away under my knife. The smell of fresh apples filled the air, sweet and familiar, bringing with it memories of other kitchens, other days, when baking was an act of love, a way to say things I didn't always know how to speak aloud. I was making a pie because I knew she loved it. Not because she had asked, and not because it was a special occasion. I had simply noticed, over time, the way her eyes softened when she ate it, the way she would go back for a second slice without hesitation. Making that pie felt like a small bridge between us, a quiet offering, a reminder that I was still here, still trying, still willing to give something of myself. As I worked, I was lost in my thoughts, counting apples, measuring time by the steady rhythm of my hands. I didn't notice her at first. Then I felt it, that subtle awareness of being watched. I glanced up and saw her standing a few steps away, leaning against the counter with her arms loosely crossed. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't frowning either. Her face was unreadable, calm in a way that made my stomach tighten. She watched me for a moment, and in that moment, I felt exposed, like everything I was thinking and feeling was somehow visible on my face. I wondered if she could see how carefully I was moving, how afraid I was of doing something wrong even in something as simple as peeling apples. I wondered if she could see how much hope I had placed in such a small gesture. Then she cleared her throat. It was a small sound, almost nothing, but it cut through the quiet of the kitchen like a blade. My hands paused mid-motion, the apple still in my palm, the knife resting against its skin. I knew, in that instant, that something was about to change. I didn't know what yet, but my heart seemed to recognize the moment before my mind did. That's when she said it. Not cruelly. Not kindly. Just calmly. I think it would be better if you found somewhere else to stay. The words settled into the space between us, heavy and still. They didn't rush at me. They didn't shout. They simply existed, undeniable and complete. For a second, everything else disappeared. The sunlight, the apples, the quiet hum of the house faded into the background, leaving only that sentence echoing in my head. I turned my head slowly and looked at my son. He was sitting at the table, his hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his eyes fixed on the surface in front of him. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at her. He didn't say a word. I waited. I waited for him to speak, to laugh it off, to say there had been a misunderstanding. I waited for him to defend me, to remind her that I was his mother, that this was my home too. I waited for any sign that this decision had not already been made without me. But he stayed silent. And in that silence, I heard everything. His silence answered everything I had been afraid to ask. It told me that this conversation had happened before, just not with me present. It told me that my feelings had been considered and set aside. It told me that my place in their lives had already been decided, and that decision did not include me. In that moment, I realized that I had already been gone in their hearts long before she found the courage to say the words out loud. I had been fading for a while, becoming a shadow that moved quietly through their home, careful not to disturb, easy to overlook. This was not the beginning of the end. It was simply the moment the end finally spoke. The apple slipped from my hand and landed softly on the counter. I didn't bother to pick it up. The pie was never baked. The apples, peeled and waiting, stayed exactly where they were, like an unfinished thought. I don't remember saying anything else. I don't remember if she said anything after that. It all blurred together, wrapped in the strange calm that had settled over me. I turned off the light, even though it was still bright outside. I washed my hands slowly, watching the water carry away the faint stickiness of apple juice, as if it could wash away the moment too. I dried them carefully on a towel, folding it neatly, just as she had folded the dish towel that first day she spoke to me so calmly. The small, ordinary actions felt important, like anchors holding me together. Then I walked back to my room. Each step down the hallway felt heavier than the last. The walls seemed closer, the air thicker. I passed the door to the living room, the bathroom, the bedroom that had once been mine in a different way, when I was welcome without question. I closed my door gently behind me, the soft click of the latch sounding louder than it should have. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at my hands. They looked old to me then, more than they ever had before. I thought about everything those hands had done, everything they had held, everything they had given. And now, they trembled slightly, resting uselessly in my lap. I packed without crying. Not yet. I folded my clothes carefully, placing them into my suitcase one by one. I wrapped fragile items in old scarves, tucking them in the corners to keep them safe. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if speed might cause me to lose control. My chest felt tight, but my eyes stayed dry. It was as if my tears were waiting for permission, for a safer place to fall. I told myself I would cry later, when I was alone, when no one could see me. For now, I focused on the sound of zippers, the feel of fabric, the simple task of putting one life away so I could step into whatever came next. I didn't know then where I would go. I didn't know how I would start over. All I knew was that something had ended quietly that afternoon, in a kitchen filled with sunlight and the smell of apples, and nothing would ever feel quite the same again. Every item I touched held a memory, and that was the hardest part. Packing was not just about clothes or objects, It was about lifting pieces of my life one by one and deciding where they would go, and where they would no longer belong. My suitcase lay open on the bed, waiting patiently, while I stood there, unsure of where to begin. The room was quiet in a way that felt different from any silence I had known before. This was not the peaceful quiet of rest or the comfortable quiet of familiarity. This was a silence filled with endings. I reached first for a scarf from my younger days, one I had worn when my hair was still dark and my steps were light. The fabric was soft from years of use, carrying the faint scent of a time when I still believed I had endless tomorrows. I held it against my cheek for a moment, closing my eyes as memories rose up uninvited. I remembered wearing it to work on cold mornings, tucking it carefully around my neck before stepping out into a world that demanded so much of me. That scarf had seen me through grief and hope, through exhaustion and quiet victories. Folding it now felt like folding away a version of myself that no longer existed. Nearby, on the small table by the window, stood a photo of my children smiling. It was an old picture, the edges worn, the colors faded just enough to remind me of its age. They were young then, carefree, their faces open and trusting. I traced their smiles with my finger, feeling a tightness in my chest that made it hard to breathe. Everything I had done, every sacrifice, every night spent awake worrying, had been for them. Looking at that photo, I wondered how time had carried us so far from that moment, how love could stretch and thin without breaking completely. There were letters too, bundled together with a faded ribbon, letters I never threw away. Some were from my husband, written in careful handwriting, full of promises and ordinary details. Others were from my children, written during school years and early adulthood, filled with updates and small confessions. I had kept them all, moving them from place to place, through apartments and changes, because they reminded me that I had once been needed, once been missed. I placed them gently into my suitcase, as if they were fragile, as if rough handling might erase the words inside. I moved slowly, deliberately, giving myself time with each object. A worn book with notes scribbled in the margins. A small trinket given to me on a birthday long ago. Simple things that would mean nothing to anyone else, but everything to me. Each one carried a story, and with every story came a quiet ache, a reminder of how much life I had lived, and how much of it had slipped past without my noticing. Eventually, I sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping slightly under my weight, and picked up a picture of my son as a child. He was standing in the yard, missing one front tooth, grinning proudly at the camera. His eyes were bright, full of trust and possibility. I stared at that picture for a long time, letting the memory of that boy fill the room. I remembered the sound of his laughter, the way he used to run toward me with his arms open, certain that I would always catch him. I never meant to stay forever, I whispered to the empty room. The words fell softly, almost apologetically, as if I needed to explain myself to someone who wasn't there. I wanted him to know that I hadn't planned to be a burden, that I hadn't intended to take up space that wasn't mine. I had only wanted to be close, to feel like I still belonged somewhere in this world. I wasn't angry. That surprised me, even then. I thought anger would come, sharp and burning, demanding to be felt. But it didn't. What I felt instead was a deep, bone-weary tiredness. The kind of tired that settles into your muscles and your soul, the kind that comes from years of holding yourself together, from always being the strong one, the understanding one, the one who makes room for everyone else. I was tired of adjusting. Tired of apologizing. Tired of trying to be invisible. As night fell, the room grew darker, shadows stretching across the walls. I zipped my suitcase closed slowly, the sound loud in the quiet. It felt final, like a door shutting on a chapter of my life. I sat there for a few more moments, listening to the house, to the distant sounds of dishes clinking and voices murmuring somewhere far away. No one came to check on me. No one knocked on the door. That silence confirmed what I already knew. When it was time to leave, I picked up my suitcase and opened the door. The hallway looked the same as it always had, but I felt different moving through it. lighter in some ways, heavier in others. Each step carried me closer to the front door, closer to a future I hadn't planned, but could no longer avoid. At the door, I paused. My hand rested on the handle, cool and solid beneath my fingers. For a moment, I thought about turning around, about looking back one last time at the place that had been my home, however briefly. But I didn't. That night, as I closed the door behind me, I didn't look back. Because some goodbyes are too heavy for the eyes, and some endings are easier to carry forward than to face again.